I was 29 when I realized the softest things can cut the deepest lace whispers. The polite smile of a sister who has already decided who I am in her story. I am the eldest daughter, the one who stayed when school applications turned into hospital schedules, the one who learned to lift my mother without letting her dignity slip, the one who cooked and called and covered bills while everyone else promised to help when things calmed down. They never did. But I did because I am a woman who was taught that love is proven in the quiet, unphotographed hours. If I have a fault worth engraving on stone, it is that I believed sacrifice guaranteed safety. That belief died the night my sister held up a champagne flute and announced she had good news about the house. The house. My grandmother's stubborn little cottage with the slanted porch and the apricot tree that shed suns onto the grass every July. The house where my mother recovered between chemo rounds, where I learned the measured patience of steeping tea and the precise hope of checking for breath at 2 a.m. The house that smelled like laundry soap and citrus and the back of my grandmother's neck when she hugged me after church. My grandmother taught me that keeping is an art. Keep seeds, keep receipts, keep your word. The house kept us, and I thought that meant we would keep it. I thought wrong. It was my sister's engagement party, all white flowers and rented laughter, the kind of evening that wants to be a photograph so badly it forgets to be true. I had pinned my hair in the bathroom of a hotel room I couldn't afford, slipped into a dress that held me together like a secret, and told myself to be graceful. She is 24, I reminded the mirror. She is the baby who collected moths and named them queens. She is not your enemy. But when she stood on the little platform they had called a stage and said the house would be a perfect investment property once we close, her voice smoothed itself over my shock, like icing over a burned cake. I felt the floor tilt, but no one else stumbled. Her fiancé squeezed her waist and beamed as if he had personally invented profit. Our uncle, my mother's brother, the executor with a watch that caught light like a blade, clapped first, then louder. "Smart girl," he said, teeth bright. "You've got your grandmother's business sense." I bit my tongue hard enough to taste iron because my grandmother had 100 things, but the business of using home as bait was not one of them. After the applause, I found my sister near the bar, where the bottles lined up like soldiers. I mean to tell this gently, but I will be honest, my voice broke. "You can't sell the house," I said, focusing on the knot of pearls at her throat so I would not watch her pupils harden. "It's not a property. It's the only place Mom could breathe." She smiled in the way people are trained to smile in wedding magazines, serene, curated, unassailable. "I know you're emotional," she said, "but Uncle says it's best. Taxes, maintenance, all the adult words." She lifted her glass. "Besides, I'm starting a family. We need our own foundation." I wanted to tell her that I have lived my life as foundation, that my hands were the cement that kept the roof from caving in on all of us. But I have learned that some truths are pearls to swine lovely wasted trampled. I put my glass down and excused myself like a lady and walked out into cold air that felt honest. The night had the kind of clarity that strips everything of mercy. I realized then that the people you love can talk you into believing your memories are a weakness. I left the party and drove to the cottage on muscle memory because grief takes you to the last place you felt safe. The porch complained under my heels the way it always had, a familiar scold. I unlocked the door with the key I was not supposed to still have and stepped into a house that held its breath as if it knew we were about to say goodbye without saying it. The apricot sweet air was gone, replaced by mothballs and dust, the smell of a place that has been braced for an appraisal. I went straight to my grandmother's sewing room. It was a small square of a space with a pale blue wall and a window that watched the yard, like a mother watches a sleeping child, ready to keep foxes away with sheer vigilance. The singer still rested on the desk, the needle upright, like the single candle we kept lit beside my mother's photograph. I opened drawers that clicked the way they always had, and found the things that kept us clothed and mended, thimbles, chalk, a tin of straight pins labeled with her looping hand. Under the tissue-thin patterns, I found the veil, I had almost forgotten she made it for me the spring before she died, when we still believed my engagement wouldn't end in an apology. A veil means you walk through softness towards something strong. She said, her fingers floating the lace across my hair, like blessing. We never planned the wedding that would have made use of it. The veil had become a ghost that followed me through closed doors. I lifted it now and watched the lace spill over my wrists, water cobweb prayer. It snagged on something at the edge. I turned it and saw the careful, almost invisible line of whip stitch along the hem, the way she used when she wanted to hide a pocket inside a pocket. My grandmother had been an artist of concealment, the good kind, the kind that keeps love warm long past the season it was earned. My fingers found the seam's mouth and coaxed it open. Inside was an envelope thin as a pressed petal, sealed with the sort of tape she used on jam jars. I do not think I breathed while I opened it. The paper inside was thick and deliberate. On top was her note in the tidy print she reserved for doctors and banks. If I am gone and you are afraid, read this first. Beneath it, a notarized letter dated 2 months before she died. I read the words twice to understand that they were real. She left the house to me, not to the family, not to the children. To me by name and by reason, because I am the child who kept the doors open and the kettle warm. Because I am the keeper of recipes and stories, and the sort of silence that heals instead of hides. Because she had seen what I had given not in greed, but in gratitude, and wanted me to have one thing that could not be taken without a fight. The codicil had been filed with a lawyer whose name I recognized only because he sent a sympathy card when she passed. And with it a sentence: if anyone alters the deed without your knowledge, ask the county for the transfer logs and call Mrs. Torres in records. She owes me a favor. My hands shook so hard the veil rippled like a disturbed pool. I felt the strange heat of vindication and the colder heat of terror. Either my uncle had never seen this codicil, which meant he had failed at the one thing he was meant to do, or he had seen it and decided we would all pretend it did not exist. One path meant incompetence. The other meant betrayal. In either, my sister had stood atop a stage and sold a future that was not hers to sell. It is an ugly thing to feel right where you wish you were wrong. I sat on the floor with my grandmother's name warm under my thumb and let the first wave hit the anger, the exhaustion, the tired rebuke of every instinct that tells a woman to make herself small. I thought of my mother, how she smiled without all her teeth that last year, how she wrote lists of what I should keep the wooden spoon, keep the yellow quilt, keep your sense of humor even when it feels like a bad fit. She had not warned me to keep proof. She trusted that love would be obvious. I folded the letter back into its pocket and took photos of everything front, back, seal, signature, because stories can be scrubbed but ink is stubborn. Then I drove home in a silent car that felt full of voices. My sister's laugh from the party, my uncle's praise, my grandmother's firm whisper saying, "If I am gone and you are afraid, read this first." I did not sleep. Fear is a caffeine that doesn't ask for permission. The next morning I called the lawyer. He remembered my grandmother immediately, the way people remember a teacher who made them sharpen their pencils twice. He confirmed the codicil, told me it should have been incorporated into the estate plan, told me the executor had been notified at the time. I thanked him with a steadiness I did not feel hung up, and turned to the county records. Mrs. Torres's voice, when I reached her, moved with the no-nonsense kindness of women who get things done while other people are deciding if they should. She found the transfer logs while I held my breath like a child under water. There was a quitclaim deed recorded 4 months after your grandmother died, she said. From the estate to a family trust managed by your uncle. That's fast. Her pause was the sound of someone peering over a fence and not liking what she saw. Come down today, she added. Bring whatever you have, and honey, don't come alone. I called no one. Not because I didn't have people to call, but because I needed to feel the weight of my own feet. I held the veil like a relic and told myself there is a version of love that lets itself be sold. I am done with that version. I am done being the woman who makes herself into a bridge, and then apologizes when people drive over her too hard. On the way to the county building, a cloudless heat pressed the city flat. I parked beneath the uneven shade of a sycamore, and watched its leaves tremble like a held breath. Something like calm threaded through me, not soft, but steel. I was not here to beg. I was here to restore. It felt important to use that word the way judges do when they reverse harm without pretending it never happened. Restoration is not erasure, it is the clean line drawn after a paragraph of lies. Inside the records office smelled like old paper and lemon cleaner. Mrs. Torres met me at the window with an expression that said she had already chosen a side. She led me to a back room with a fan that squeaked every third rotation and slid the file across the table like contraband. The quitclaim deed was there, all tidy notary stamp and legalese. So was a power of attorney my uncle had filed on my mother's behalf 2 weeks before her last hospital stay, granting him limited rights for estate efficiency. My mother's signature looked right, but I have learned that looking right is a talent forged in hell. "Do you want me to pull the audio from the notary appointment?" Mrs. Torres asked. "Sometimes they keep it depending on the office." I nodded because the world is no longer kind to women who take people at their word. While she made calls, I read the trust document that had been wedged on top. My sister's fiancé was listed as a prospective manager upon marriage. My stomach soured, the timeline yawned open like a trap. I felt the first stone settle in my chest, the one that would grow into a resolve people mistake for cruelty. It is not cruelty to stop someone from taking what is yours. It is not cruelty to say no, to say enough to say, "I am not the bridge, I am the river, and you will not cross me without permission." I copied what I was allowed to copy, thanked Mrs. Torres with my whole body, and stepped back into a heat that had matured into something like glare. On the courthouse steps, my phone buzzed. My sister's name bloomed on the screen, pink and innocuous, the color of the dress she wore to make herself look softer than she is. I almost didn't answer, but the part of me that still believed in salvaging picked up. Her voice spilled through sweet and firm. "I hope you're happy for me," she said. "Uncle says we can list the house by next week. Oh, and if you've still got that old veil, maybe I can wear it for the ceremony. It would mean so much." I laughed, not mean, but clean, the kind of laugh that slices a rope. For the first time in months, my lungs unlatched. The veil lay folded in the passenger seat, a letter sewn into its hem like a spine. "Grandmother, I thought you kept your word even from the other side of the river. I will keep mine from here." I did not tell my sister about the letter in the hem. I let her words dangle in the air between us like a ribbon that would never tie. I told her I was happy she was happy, and that I would think about the veil, and when I ended the call, I sat very still in the driver's seat and let the heat from the windshield bake the indecision out of me. My grandmother had stitched a spine into lace. I would have to grow one into my own back. I opened my notes app and wrote the words the lawyer had used: codicil, executor's duty, quitclaim, power of attorney, and then wrote the words, "I understood, promise, theft, restoration." If language is how the world gets carved, I would learn to carve with both sets of tools. The lawyer saw me that afternoon, a man with soft eyes and an iron jaw who did not pretend the mess was smaller than it was. He read the codicil once and nodded in the way carpenters do when a measurement comes out true. He called it enforceable. He called it binding. He called the transfer highly irregular and the timeline hungry. He asked if I wanted war or warning. I said I wanted the sale stopped and the truth to stand up on its own legs. He prepared a petition to restore title and a motion to place a lis pendens on the property so no one could sell it, while we argued. I watched him file through an online portal that hummed like a drawbridge lowering. He explained we could seek a temporary restraining order to freeze activity, then build a case brick by brick. The letter, the records, the audio, the witness who heard my grandmother say, "The house was mine." "Do you have a witness?" he asked. I thought of the neighbor with the swing that creaked like a hymn and said I might. When I left his office, the light had shifted from white to amber, and everything looked less cruel. I drove to the cottage again because fear still insisted on touching the doorknob. The porch boards flexed under me as if remembering the weight and cadence of my feet. Inside, the rooms had ripened from closed house stale to something like expectation. I turned on a fan and opened a window and called the neighbor, Mrs. Linden, who had watched me grow out of pigtails and into grocery lists. She shuffled across her lawn in sandals that tried not to fall apart. When she stepped into the kitchen, she touched the counter with the reverence reserved for altars and piano tops. She remembered my grandmother, the apron, the laugh, the way she ended every story with a moral she claimed to be only half serious. Yes, she said she had heard my grandmother say the house would be mine. More than once. She would tell a judge that if a judge wanted to hear it. She had also heard my uncle tell an appraiser over the fence in the tone menus when they believe they are only practicing strategy that he could clean up a title faster than a spill. She shook her head, then the way the elderly shake their heads when the young forget their elders kept notes on the entire neighborhood long before social media and group texts pretended to invent observation. I thanked her until thank yous felt thin, and then I walked the perimeter of the house the way my grandmother had taught me to walk the perimeter of a garden, not to defend it from invaders, but to remind it that it is held. The apricot tree's leaves were curled and dusty, so I carried a bucket until my arms ached and gave the roots a slow drink. Somewhere under all the paperwork, this was the work, this was the debt paid forward. After I finished, I sat on the back steps and let the sweat dry and felt the old ache that had once made me volunteer for every midnight fever, every dawn ride to the pharmacy. I have loved my family so hard, I have become a utility. I have loved them without asking to be loved back in ways that cost them something. The house was the first time love loved me back, like a wall around a garden. I would not let it be flipped like a coin. The next morning, the notary's office called. There was no audio file. That office did not record appointments, but there was a log that read like a rehearsal schedule: time, date, witnesses, present, identification types. The witnesses were two clerks who had both since left. The ID was my mother's driver's license, which told me only that she had had a license that day. We would need more. The lawyer's paralegal began calling hospice nurses to find out who had been in the house the week the papers were signed, who had seen my mother strong, and who had seen her thin as thread. Mrs. Torres, the clerk who had become an ally, simply by choosing not to look away, found a duplicate copy of my grandmother's codicil nestled in a batch of filings from a year earlier, as if it had tried to surface but been pushed back under a stack. Each new piece felt like a plank over a ravine. Maybe this is what courage is: not the absence of fear, but the accumulation of planks until a bridge holds your weight. My uncle called me that afternoon. His voice arrived smiling. He congratulated me on finding a hobby. He suggested I let adults handle adult problems. He told me my sister had already mentally moved into a townhouse she had not bought, as if imagination confers title. When I said we had filed to stop the sale, his voice sharpened one notch, then smoothed again the way men who believe in inevitability smooth their voice as if they can buff the edges off your resolve. He said, "You'll only embarrass yourself." I said, "We'll see." He said, "You won't like what a trial pulls into the light." I said, "That's why I'm doing it." I did not say that I hoped he was bluffing, that I feared the thing he would drag into light was a piece of my mother I had not made peace with. Love makes us brave, but fear keeps our stomachs honest. 2 days later, the sheriff's deputy knocked on my door with the temporary restraining order in his hand, official and unambiguous. No sale, no listing, no changes. The paper felt heavier than paper. I drove straight to the cottage and taped a copy inside the glass of the front door like a boundary made visible. The neighbor across the street watched me with arms crossed and then lifted one open palm, not wave exactly, something more solemn. A car I did not recognize slowed as it passed, then sped up, the way guilt sometimes does. Around sunset, my sister texted a photograph of a cake that said, "Under contract, soon," in blue frosting. I stared at it until my jaw stopped clenching, and then answered with a photograph of the order. No words. My phone stayed silent for an hour, then erupted first with her, then with my uncle, then with a number I didn't know that turned out to be her fiancé calling me dramatic and ungrateful. I turned the phone face down on the table and sat with the word dramatic until it lost its power. Drama is insisting the scene is normal when the house is already on fire. Refusing drama is sounding the alarm and carrying water anyway. Court came fast and slow the way crises do, both dragging and barreling. On the first morning, I wore my grandmother's locket and shoes that would not betray me on marble. The judge was a woman with the kind of gaze that fixes rotten beams without raising her voice. She read the filings with a mouth that did not wiggle and asked questions that did not let anyone hide in grammar. My uncle wore a suit the color of expensive denial. My sister sat behind him, a soft scarf around her neck, the fiancé's knee angled toward the aisle for easy escape. When the judge asked about the codicil, my uncle called it a misunderstanding. When she asked about the quitclaim, he called it efficiency. When she asked about the power of attorney, he called it necessary. When she asked why the executor had never told the named beneficiary that she had been named, he said he had meant to, and somehow the meaning had never become the saying. The judge called that regrettable. I watched my sister's face move through surprise defense calculation and something like shame. It is not fashionable to admit that part of me softened. Perhaps because I recognized myself in her, the girl who wants what she wants and the woman who may one day learn that wanting alone is not a title. The judge did not decide that day. She extended the freeze and told us to bring her the witness and anything else that smelled like truth. On the courthouse steps, the air felt like a held note that refuses to resolve. My sister approached me a little too quickly, the way you can tell someone is walking toward you with a script. She said she wished this hadn't gotten ugly. She said she had just wanted to secure a future. She said Uncle had explained that I was making work for everyone. I said I was finished being everyone's work. Her eyes welled and I almost reached for her, but behind her my uncle adjusted his cuff and the spell broke. There is a difference between vulnerability and rehearsal, and I was done clapping for the second one. That night I could not sleep. I walked my apartment like a penitent trying to wear a groove into the tile. On the coffee table, the veil lay folded like a tame animal. I thought of the pocket my grandmother had sewn a secret that had never asked to be dramatic, only to be durable. I whispered thank you to the woman who remains the north in my compass. I fell asleep near dawn and dreamt of thread miles of it, an ocean of it, and me learning to use a needle, not just to mend, but to write. In the morning, Mrs. Linden put on her stiffest skirt and held my elbow up the courthouse steps. She sat straight in the witness chair and told the judge about the tea on the porch and the conversation that ran through summer air like a ribbon, my grandmother insisting the house would be mine because homes prefer the hands that tend them, because love needs a place to set its bowl down. She said my grandmother had joked that if anyone tried to get clever, she had gotten clever first with the county clerk and the backup papers. The judge's mouth did a thing like a nearly smile. The notary's ex-clerk, reached by subpoena, appeared on a grainy video call and said she remembered my mother pale and quiet and signing slowly. She could not swear my mother had understood every clause. She could swear my uncle had been very decisive. The judge's eyes did not change, but the air did. We left our arguments there on the wood and went home to wait. Waiting is a sport I have trained for. It is the sport of daughters who sit outside operating rooms and inside pharmacies, and in the hallway with a coat around their shoulders, while someone they love learns to breathe again. My phone stayed near, but I did not feed it my attention. I watered the plant that refuses to die. I wiped the counter the way my grandmother taught me, with a firm wrist and a small circle, and when the call came, I answered with both hands. The judge's order ran longer than I expected, and I read it more than once because victory is a language that feels foreign when you have lived inside accommodation. She restored the title to me, citing the codicil and intent, and called the quitclaim void, as a cloud that should never have shadowed the land. She recommended the bar look at my uncle's conduct. She called my sister's reliance unfortunate but not dispositive, and reminded her that houses are not earned by announcement. My eyes burned in that old grateful way that feels like rinsing. I drove to the cottage with a printed copy of the order and taped it where the restraining paper had been. The porch sighed under my weight like a body unclenching. I unlocked the door and said into empty air that still held echoes we're home. It would be cleaner to say forgiveness arrived than to tie a ribbon and draw a line. But forgiveness is a country you cross inch by inch. I did not rush toward it because I wanted the lesson to set that love without boundaries is not love. It is weather, and weather erodes. I called my sister the next day and told her she could still wear the veil, not because I had to, but because I wanted her to walk toward something strong. She cried then in a way that did not feel rehearsed, and I listened until the call clicked into quiet, and then I walked the house again, touching door frames like prayer beads. That night I slept in the small bedroom with the window that stares at the apricot tree. At dawn, light pooled on the floor the way it used to when my mother slept in this bed, and asked me to open the curtains just so. I lay there and thought about the version of me who would have let the sale happen, because peace is cheaper than conflict. I wanted to hold her hand. I wanted to tell her that peace bought with silence is a mortgage you pay forever. I wanted to tell her that sometimes revenge is not a fire that consumes, but a refusal to be erased. And sometimes karma is nothing mystical at all, only the steady return of what was promised arriving with paperwork and witnesses, and a woman who refuses to be talked out of the truth she can prove. In the late morning, a letter slid through the mail slot. My uncle's handwriting tidy, expensive. He offered an apology shaped like a negotiation. He asked if we could reimagine the future together. He suggested a trust. I folded the letter once and placed it under the leg of a wobbly table. Some things are exactly useful enough. I brewed tea in the chipped pot that has outlived trends and men and arguments. I carried a cup to the back steps and watched the tree shift its shoulders in a wind that had finally remembered how to be gentle. I thought of all the women in my family, my grandmother with her needle, my mother with her lists, me with my filings, and I understood that we had been stitching the same sentence across 3 generations: we keep what keeps us. I did not pretend the victory closed the book. Paper restores a title, it does not reweave a family. In the days after the judge's order, I moved through the cottage like a woman learning a room she already knows, touching baseboards, testing windows, listening for the places where the house still flinched. I replaced the batteries in the smoke detectors. I swept the porch in long, quiet strokes. I made a list of repairs on the back of an old church bulletin because I wanted the words to live with prayers, not invoices. Every act felt both practical and ceremonial, as if I were convincing the house I would keep it kept. The veil stayed on the kitchen table, folded into a pale square that glowed in certain light. I had told my sister she could wear it, and I meant it, but the thought of my grandmother's lace crowning a ceremony built on paperwork, drafted by men who had called my boundaries inconvenient, lodged like a burr under my ribs. I sat with the discomfort until it began to tell the truth it had been carrying. I was afraid the veil would be taken and never returned. I was afraid that offering would be read as an invitation to take again. Fear has a habit of calling itself prudence. Prudence has a habit of dressing like fear. I decided I would carry the veil to the wedding myself and take it home myself. Love could be generous without being naive. The dress fitting was scheduled for a Monday afternoon in a boutique that smelled like lilies and expensive relief. My sister stood on the little platform while women pinned silk as if it were surgery. I watched her face in the mirror and wondered what part of her was still ate and sticky with apricot jam, what part had learned to smile while taking. When the seamstress asked about a veil, my sister's eyes found mine in the glass. She did not speak. She did not need to. I nodded. The seamstress clapped once, in that rehearsed way of people who sell joy by the yard. My sister exhaled, and for a heartbeat, I saw the girl, and not the beneficiary. We left with a pickup time and a list that did not include the word repentance. I understood then that reconciliation is not a line but a weather pattern. It changes without asking. That night alone in the cottage, I unfolded the veil to check for loose stitches. The hem's secret pocket lay flat against my palm, its tape resealed with care. I slid a finger along the edge to be sure it would not catch on hairpins, and felt an inconsistency, another seam tucked under the first finer, like the ghost of a stitch. I held the lace up to the light. The thread caught the lamp in 3 tiny glints. My grandmother had sewn a second mouth behind the first. I eased it open, half expecting to find only the memory of thread. There was a key. It was small and brass with a tag that had been rubbed almost blank by time. The remaining letters made a suggestion rather than a promise, SD-17. Safe deposit, I thought, and then I said it aloud, because sometimes naming a thing is what turns fear into instruction. My grandmother had called me a keeper. Keepers inherit the map and the treasure and the responsibility to know which one is which. I drove to the bank with the calm of someone who already understands what is at stake. The manager recognized my grandmother's name the way the lawyer had, with a softness that belongs to people who have been treated as souls in places that pretend everything is an account. Behind the cubicle wall, a vault door closed with a sigh like a tired animal. The box, when it slid onto the little table, was lighter than my dread. Inside lay the kind of archive women assemble while men are busy calling themselves visionaries. There were receipts for hospice payments that had never been deducted from the insurance my uncle had promised to manage. There were letters from my grandmother, to the executor sent, certified noting the codicil, each stamped, received in red, each followed by a hand-scrawled, handled, each unreflected, in the final distribution. There was a ledger in my grandmother's precise script columns, neat as fence posts, showing deposits and withdrawals for a house account she had kept since my mother first got sick. The last 2 pages were lists of names with notes beside them. Mrs. Linden's gas bill covered in February church roof fund, neighbor kids' braces. My tuition check that I had never known was hers. My throat tightened at that. To be kept without your knowledge is both blessing and burden. You owe gratitude and also the work of letting yourself be held without shame. At the bottom of the box lay a photograph I had not seen my grandmother on the cottage steps the summer before she died, her hand on the railing, head turned toward someone just out of frame, my uncle perhaps, or me. The back of the photo held a line in her print. The person who loves this house will always have somewhere to stand. I put the photo against my chest for a breath, then returned it to the box with reluctance that felt like reverence. I took copies. I did not take originals. I have learned that power is as much about what you leave in place as what you remove. On my way home, my phone lit with an invitation sent to all core family and honored guests for a rehearsal dinner toast. I stopped at a red light and imagined lifting a glass and saying nothing, and imagined lifting a glass and saying everything. My grandmother would have chosen a third way, saying enough. Enough to turn a room, not to turn it to salt. I texted a simple acceptance. I folded the copied paper into the inner pocket of my bag. I rehearsed sentences in my mouth the way you rehearse vows, words you intend to live under after you say them. The rehearsal came with the brittle cheerfulness of events designed to be photographed. My sister fluttered through her paces, radiant the way people are when they believe the future is a hallway without doors. The fiancé shook my uncle's hand with 2 hands, the way men do when they need to borrow legitimacy. The restaurant's back room gleamed like a promise. The toast began with the expected, the best friend anecdotes, the jokes about how she never returns calls, the polished myth of how he proposed. I smiled and swallowed and kept my hands still in my lap. When it was my turn, I stood. I did not raise my glass. I placed it down because I wanted my hands free. I spoke as the eldest daughter, the woman who had kept the oxygen bins filled, and the oven set low, and the calendar from devouring our days. I spoke as the person my grandmother had trusted with lace and law, and the kind of soft power that looks like casserole but moves like a tide. I did not name crimes. I named values. I said our family had been saved more than once by women who prepared for storms while the forecast still called for sun. I said keeping is an art, and so is returning. I said I was lending the veil because I believe in walking through softness toward something strong. My sister cried the way brides do in television shows. My uncle lifted his napkin to his mouth and hid an expression that did not suit the room. The fiancé squeezed my sister's shoulder as if he had obtained a signature. I sat down with my heart thudding, and knew both that I had told the truth, and that it would not do all the work truth sometimes promises to do. The room returned quickly to its own narrative. Some people learn only from consequence. Consequence would come. On the morning of the wedding, I braided my hair like armor and carried the veil in a garment bag tucked under my arm the way you tuck a baby to your side when you must cross a busy street. The church was full of flowers and expectation. I found my sister in the vesting room, a little girl's name on the door in calligraphy, a woman in white inside rehearsing how to belong to someone else. I helped pin the veil, careful with the comb, careful with the pocket that had already given up two secrets. I looked at her in the mirror and saw both of us there, my face older, steadier, hers luminous with hope, and something else I didn't want to diagnose on a day that wanted blessing. When the coordinator called first positions, I kissed her temple because some rituals are their own truth. In the third pew during the reading about love being patient and kind, my bag buzzed. I do not bring phones to moments that pretend to be holy, but I had not learned to trust the world again, so I slipped it out and saw an email from the clerk of the court. The Bar Association had opened an inquiry. A simple line, almost bureaucratic, and yet it felt like the sound diesel engines make when a ferry changes direction. Accountability had begun to move with a weight that could not be argued away at a dinner. At the reception, under chandeliers that made the room look like a dream a child would have about grown-ups, I watched my uncle make his way to the bandleader. He had the face of a man auditioning for magnanimity. He took the microphone and spoke about family and legacy and how love forgives all. He mentioned homes without naming them. He made himself the architect of the evening's mercy. People clapped because people like sermons that ask nothing. My anger rose, then flattened, then clarified. I have learned to choose the moment that is mine and leave the rest to gravity. After cake and a dance I could not watch, I went outside to pull air into my ribs and found Mrs. Linden on the bench near the hydrangeas, shoes off, laughter tucked into the line of her mouth. She patted the spot beside her, and we sat like women who have watched towns try to reinvent themselves and remain exactly what they are. She told me my grandmother would have approved of the toast and disapproved of the band. She told me that men who confuse benevolence with ownership will eventually misread a locked door as an invitation. When they do, she said, you keep yours locked and your heart open and your evidence neat. Near midnight, when the send-off sparklers sparked and died, I claimed the veil with quiet hands and slipped into the night with it like a relic regained. I drove to the cottage on back streets because I wanted to arrive like dawn, not intervention. I laid the veil on the bed and stood in the doorway until my breathing matched the house's. A breeze came through the window and lifted one corner of lace. For an instant I saw my grandmother's hand pinching the edge to inspect a seam. I whispered goodnight to the air and the apricot tree and my younger self. In the weeks after the inquiry bent toward charges, my uncle's letters changed their verbs, first suggesting, then requesting, then pleading. My sister sent an apology stripped of decoration. I did not send her back to the beginning. I met her where she had managed to arrive. We began to speak like women who might someday tell a truth together on a porch. The fiancé receded into the background like a season that had finished. I had the locks changed not because I expected invasion, but because it felt like drawing a clean line through a sentence that had wandered. I cleaned out the sewing room and left it mostly as it was. The singer stayed. The tin of pins stayed. I placed the ledger on the shelf where we used to keep hymnals and the codicil in a fireproof box beside my passport. The safe deposit key went back into the veil's second pocket because legacy deserves symmetry. I did not become a woman who trusts paper more than people, but I became a woman who knows the difference between love and leverage. Both are four-letter words. Only one breathes when you hold it. On the first cool morning of September, I picked 3 apricots that had hung on stubbornly and cut them into a bowl with a squeeze of lemon and a spoon of sugar. I ate them on the back step and felt the house settle around me like a shawl. I thought of the version of revenge that would have tempted me once the scorching the speech. the satisfaction of witnesses, and I understood why my grandmother had chosen a needle instead of a torch. A seam can be stronger than the fabric it mends. A quiet record can outlast a loud theft. Karma, I realized, is not a cosmic hammer. It is a ledger kept by women in pencil that does not smudge when the truth is finally breathed against it. In the afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table and wrote a letter to the girl I had been on the engagement night, the girl who thought grace meant allowing herself to be edited out of her own story. I told her that grace also means saying no with your whole body. I told her that home is not a place you inherit. It is a place you keep until it learns your name and says it back. I signed it with the name my grandmother used when she was pleased with me. Then I folded the letter and slipped it into the veil's first pocket behind the codicil copies, so that one day some other woman with my stubborn chin will find it and feel less alone at a kitchen table covered in lace and law. I am not naive enough to call this an ending. It is a season with more ripening to do. But when I lock the door at night and the porch light throws its faithful circle across the steps, I feel the past take one respectful step back. I feel the future stop knocking and start listening. I make tea. I write lists. I keep what keeps me. Autumn arrived like an apology, cool fingers on the wrists of a summer that had been all fever and argument. The first rain came shyly, as if asking permission to cross the threshold. I left the back door cracked and let the cottage listen. Water on apricot leaves, water on porch boards, water pattering a Morse code of relief. In the sewing room, the singer held steady on its table needle upright as a lantern wick. I had not sewn a stitch since the hearing, but most days I sat in the blue chair and read the ledger my grandmother kept, not for the numbers, but for the voice tucked between them. She itemized kindness the way some people itemize deductions. Every line said the same thing written in 100 different hands: we owe each other care. The inquiry gathered itself like a storm far out at sea, too distant to see the waves, but close enough to feel the pressure change. The bar requested documents. The court sent notices. My uncle replied with a courtesy he had never bothered to extend in life before a judge stood between us. My sister texted sometimes small offerings of news about curtains and recipes, the safe currency of women relearning how to speak. She did not mention the house except to ask about the garden and whether the hydrangeas preferred coffee grounds. I said they like what is consistent, and she replied with a heart, and I felt something change shape between us. Not forgiveness yet, but a doorway cut into an old wall. On a Saturday that had been promised to repairs, I found myself mending something else. The veil's comb had loosened. The silk tulle had caught on a hanger and held for dear life. I threaded a needle and worked with the patience my grandmother had stored in my hands like a dowry. After a while I realized I was humming some hymn that was only half a song and half a remembered kitchen conversation. I set the needle down and let my gaze wander the room. On the windowsill, a pale ribbon of sunlight trembled. Beneath it, the safe deposit key lay in the second pocket like a wink. Evidence and tenderness living in the same inch of fabric. That was the lesson in miniature keep both. When the doorbell rang, my body remembered to be cautious before my mind did. I wiped my hands on my skirt and walked to the front with the measured pace of someone who has learned to make a hallway into time. Through the beveled glass, I could see a familiar outline, shoulders drawn up against the weather hands empty. My uncle. Not in the expensive denial suit, just a raincoat gone dark at the shoulders. I opened the door only as wide as politeness requires. He stayed on his side of the threshold because even he understood how doors work. He said he wanted to talk. He said the inquiry had taken a tone. He said he had been advised to express remorse, and when the word remorse landed between us like a drop of oil, I watched his mouth twist at the taste. I let him speak because I no longer confused silence with consent. He practiced regret the way a man practices a foreign language, with too much grammar and not enough ears. He said the family was suffering. He said reputations were fragile. He said perhaps there was a settlement that would let us all look in the same mirror again without flinching. I thought of the ledger. I thought of Mrs. Linden in her stiff skirt telling the court that my grandmother meant the house for the hands that would keep it. I thought of my sister's face in the boutique mirror, the way an 8-year-old's hope had pushed up through layers of practiced entitlement like a stubborn shoot through concrete. I told him there would be no settlement that required me to forget. I told him I had learned to live without permission. I told him consequences were not vindictiveness, they were the grammar of truth. He looked past me, then into the house as if he could find a loophole in the furniture. His gaze snagged on the singer. The smallest softening moved across his face and was gone. He said almost gently that my grandmother had always been too fond of me, as if fondness were a flaw. I smiled without my teeth and said we had both benefited from her fondness in our ways. Mine came with lace and law. His had come with a long rope and too much trust in the strength of promises not to tangle themselves around our ankles. He shifted his weight and tried one more key family. The word has opened 1,000 doors for men like him. It did not open this one. I said family means we do not sell each other. He winced as if I had struck him, and for a moment I saw a boy. The one who had watched his younger sister sew and decided a needle was a small thing harmless. Then the boy hardened back into a man who prefers signatures to sentences. He left with a rehearsal of apology paired with a warning smile. On the porch, the rain got louder as if the sky had decided to stop being delicate. I closed the door and leaned my back against it and let the wood learn the shape of my resolve. The inquiry turned into charges. The letter arrived on thick paper with a seal that did not care for our family's stories. Terms like breach and conversion and fiduciary danced with less polite words, none of them dramatic, all of them heavy. My sister called that night and cried in a way that had no script. She said she felt like a girl who had lifted a lid because someone told her it was a present and found a snake. I said she was not the first person to mistake charm for authority. I did not say I had done it too, just in different rooms. We made tea on the phone together like women at separate sinks in a shared house. Small things took on weight. The day the first mailbox key with my name slid smooth into the lock, I felt 12 and 80 at the same time. The morning the plumber showed me the hairline crack in a pipe, and I made the decision to replace instead of patch, I felt like a general who had chosen the hill she would not surrender. When the apricot tree shrugged off the last of its leaves and stood there adamant and leafless, I understood something about dignity. It is not performance, it is posture. Winter asked fewer questions than autumn. It brought a kind of honesty I had not been offered in a decade. On Christmas Eve, I set the table for one and did not feel pathetic, just accurate. I placed the ledger beside my plate and read aloud the list of the year's keepings: the house restored, the veil repaired. The inquiry begun: the sister learning new language, the uncle learning consequence, the me learning to be a woman who does not bargain against herself to keep the peace. I tucked the ledger back under the singer like a hymn book under a pew. On a gray afternoon in January, I heard the porch boards complain in the rhythm that means neighbor, not stranger. Mrs. Linden came in with a jar of soup and news from the long circuit of small talk that keeps neighborhoods stitched. My uncle had stepped back from his volunteer board seats to focus on personal matters. My sister had returned the cake stand and asked for a recipe for resilience. The fiancé had turned into a past tense. We sat at the table and ate soup too hot for tongues that tell lies. When she left, she patted the doorframe as if it were a shoulder and said the house looked like it had decided to stay. Revenge is a temptation you must acknowledge to avoid. There were nights I drove past my uncle's office and imagined a speech I would never deliver and a scandal I did not need to architect. It would have been easy to tip a microphone at the world and let it devour him. But my grandmother did not raise a pyromaniac, she raised a keeper. Keeping means knowing which fires warm and which fires consume everything, including the story you hoped to save. So I chose the slow burn of accountability and the steady heat of boundary. Some evenings that choice felt heroic. Some evenings it felt like eating salad while other people had cake. Both were true, and I learned to live with both. In February, I started a practice that would have embarrassed the girl I used to be. I wrote my mother letters. I told her about the plumbing and the judge's tone, and the way the light lays a gold bar across the living room floor at 3:17 precise as a bank transfer. I told her about my sister's halting questions and more certain apologies. I told her the bar had scheduled a hearing and that I would attend if the public was allowed not to gloat but to witness. I told her I had not fallen in love yet because I was busy learning to love this house, this life, this spine I had grown after years of performing flexibility. I folded the letters into the veil's first pocket, where they made a small new weight that the lace bore without complaint. The hearing was antiseptic and ordinary and excruciating in the ways bureaucratic justice often is. My uncle's lawyer spoke in a voice designed to fatigue. The panel asked questions that held his choices up to light, turning them until they showed what they were. My uncle wore the expression of a man who has encountered at last a room not impressed by charm. He said he had made mistakes. He said he had acted in the family's best interest. He said efficiency. He said misunderstanding. He said everything but the sentence that would have been a key. I thought I could take what I wanted and explain the rest away. He left with a sanction and a suspension, and a story that would not carry him as far as he was used to traveling. Outside, the weather had the brittle brightness of a day that wants to be forgiven for being cold. My sister stood beside me in a coat that made her look smaller than she is. She slid her hand through my arm and let it rest there without claiming anything. We walked to a bakery and split an orange roll that tasted like a memory I did not know I still had. She did not ask if I felt vindicated. I did not perform humility. We ate and we walked back to the car, and I realized that sometimes the only miracle you get is two women choosing not to repeat what raised them. Spring returned without ceremony. I bought seed packets and a new broom and a book about repairing plaster without cursing. In the afternoon, I opened the windows and let the house air out its winter thoughts. In the evening, I closed them and thanked it for holding. On a Tuesday that felt like any other, my sister rang the bell and brought a photograph. It was from the wedding, the moment just before the doors opened, her veil haloing her like the gentlest kind of absolution. On the back she had written, "Thank you for letting me walk through softness towards something strong." I tucked the photo into the ledger near the line where my grandmother had once paid for my textbooks, women weaving a rope across time then handing it forward. Here is what I have learned to say, without my voice wobbling. Betrayal is not the end of the story, unless you decide it is. Karma is not a thunderclap. It is the ledger updated, the stitch redone. The door relocked, the truth told out loud, in a room where people prefer euphemism. Revenge can be refusing to be erased, yes, but the deeper revenge, the one that leaves you whole, looks like building the life they tried to sell without you. It looks like writing your name clearly where a line once said to be determined. It looks like handing a veil to a sister with one hand and holding your boundary with the other. It looks like apricots ripening because a woman chose to water the tree instead of the fire. If you have carried a secret that felt heavier than your body, if you have kept a house no one thanked you for, if you have been told your memory is a liability, hear me. Keep your receipts and your gentleness. Keep your boundaries and your grandmother's voice. Keep the light on for yourself first. Restoration is not a return to before. It is the claiming of after. It will not make the past pretty. It will make the future honest. I am still the eldest daughter. I am still the woman who makes lists and tea and vows she intends to live under. But now when I walk the perimeter at dusk and the porch bulb draws a calm circle on the steps, I am also the woman who knows that love without leverage is wishful thinking, and leverage without love is a barren empire. I keep what keeps me. I forgive at the speed of trust. And when the wind noses the veil where it hangs in the sewing room like a small milky cloud, I whisper to the air and to the women who taught me I am here. I am staying. I am not invisible inside my own life. If this story found you in a season of keeping, come sit with me in the comments and tell me what you are choosing to guard. If it gave you strength, please like, share, and subscribe. Help this little community grow into a place where women's ledgers and letters and stitches are honored. And if you know someone who needs a reminder that restoration is possible, send this to her. We keep what keeps us, and we keep each other by telling the truth.